It's Guitar Day. Welcome to Open Mind Alexander Technique. I'm Jess. Today we're talking about guitar playing and challenges and suggestions that come up from my experience of years of working with musicians with Alexander Technique. So right off the bat, there's someone that I want to make sure that you all are aware of as a fantastic resource for guitar playing and sustainable movement with guitar playing, which is my colleague and dear friend, Jonathan Leithwood. He's the head of the guitar department here at the University of Denver's Lamont School of Music. He's a spectacular classical guitarist, and he's also a certified Alexander Technique teacher. He trained at the same place I did, so we have a lot of the same experience, and we do a lot of teaching exchanges together. I've known him for many years. So he's definitely someone to be aware of, and definitely worth reaching out to if you're especially a classical guitarist who is struggling with pain and tension. He's a good name to know. So definitely get a hold of him if you're struggling with a lot of this stuff. He just happens to not run a YouTube channel, so here we are, and I'm going to talk about it too. He sends me students all the time. So when we're talking about guitar playing, most of the students that I've worked with here are classical guitarists. But I have also worked with some jazz rock guitarists too, so a lot of the same stuff still applies. The main difference between classical guitar versus jazz or rock guitar is the angle of the instrument and where the left hand needs to come up to in order to reach. So classical guitar tends to be at a much sharper angle, angled up, so the neck of the instrument is pointing up that way. And so the hand is all the way up here. So when they're tuning, it's generally roughly eye level. That's where the tuning pegs are up here. Depends on the person, of course, in proportions, but something around there. And then, of course, with jazz and rock guitar, especially if they're standing, it's going to be much more horizontal. So that's the main difference. So one of the interesting things, digging into classical guitar in particular, is they don't play with a strap, just at all, most of them. And instead they have this whole variety of wildly different gear that they use. So a couple different things that I see pretty regularly is a footstool. It's this little collapsible plastic metal thing that just holds up the leg, and then the body of the guitar leans on that, and this angle of difference between the right leg on the floor and the left leg up is what gives the instrument its angle to hold up. Another one is using some sort of, it's kind of like a hinge in between here, and it'll have like some sort of fabric thing there. I don't know what it's called, but they can have some sort of support system underneath on this side. A cool one that I've seen from a couple people that I like a lot because of how incredibly adjustable it is this giant sheet of plastic where there's a curve cut out of the bottom and a little bit of like cushioning around that curve. And then there's suction cups on that. So you turn your guitar over so it's face down, and then just suction cup this thing to the back of the guitar, which is totally safe for the instrument. And then that height, of course, is completely adjustable for you and your instrument needs, and that keeps both legs flat on the ground. So what comes up a lot is actually trying to get a chair that's low enough. That's the challenge I find for a lot of classical guitar players. This chair on me, depending on what setup I'm using, might be too tall. So let's look at why. This is a chair that's very common in this building. This is in a lot of the rehearsal spaces and faculty offices as well. I am about 5'6", 5'5", 5'6", somewhere in there. My hip joint is higher than my knees. Now, typically, I emphasize that as a good thing, and I like that, because that gives me a little bit more of an open angle between my legs and my torso. Problem is, stuff slides off the legs if you need to balance something on your legs. That's the challenge with the guitar. Don't drop it. So what I don't encourage students to do is to lift their heels to compensate for this. This is work, it's effort, it's going to really tighten up your calves a lot. And it's going to be hard to maintain a really consistent height with that, so it's not something that we recommend doing. So, for me, most likely the chair that I would sit in to play classical guitar is this guy. So this little stool puts my hip joints depending on where I sit on this stool, it's a little hammock resembling. Puts my hip joints either at or slightly below my knees, and this makes my lap here very stable and very sturdy. So if I want consistency with the height of the instrument here, this is probably a pretty good way to do it. The challenge with that is this is a tight angle between my legs and my torso. Don't let yourself tuck your tail under. That's the hard part. Along with that is taking the neck forward over the instrument and being here. Yes, this does let you look down, but one of the things that I work with all my students and guitar players, looking down comes from your legs. It's here. This is the tilt. This is the lean. And I know that Jonathan also has his guitar students work with this as well. This lean is great. It lets me look down. It lets me move and flex with the music. Of course, I should be able to move its music, right? So this tilt is really, really useful. So this is pivoting from the hip joints, and it's a lot further down than a lot of people think. So what frequently comes up is we'll work with this away from the instrument first, and then we put the guitar in their hands and they suddenly pivot from the spine instead of the hip joints. So then what I end up doing to help students learn this, so let's pretend the student is facing to the side that way. I'll put a hand at the low back and encourage them to come up and over as they're tilting. And this helps them start to learn where that pivot actually comes from, that it's a lot further down than they think. Then there's being able to turn and look at your left hand on the neck of the instrument. You'll hear some varying opinions on how much a classical guitar player should be looking at their left hand while they're playing. I want my students to be able to do both, because the reality is you're going to be doing both at some point. So let's make sure that you're doing both in a way that's healthy. Both being look at it and not look at it. So to turn your head all the way to the left, especially while tuning, to be able to look at what you're doing with your tuning pegs, is a spiral. This spiral is something that we practice away from the instrument first. We call it a spiral because it's a useful image rather than just turn or bend, because it's still about maintaining lengthening and decompression in the spine. So it's just rotating around the axis of the spine itself. So it's the difference between this rotation versus this. This is bending. So I differentiate between those two with my students just so that we have a shared language for how do we talk about these sensory experiences and these body mechanics. So here's the spiral, and that spiral can be pretty big even while seated. I can look behind me while my seat still stays in the same place. Or it can be very small. This is still a spiral. And that's going to come from a different place. Typically, most classical guitarists, when they need to turn to look at tuning pegs that are at roughly eye level, they aren't needing to spiral from all the way down into the chest and shoulders. Typically, just neck is enough. It's not that you can't, it's totally allowed, but it's worth questioning, how do we minimize effort? How do we drive this mech with the least amount of fuel? That's sustainability. So, to just turn the head and be able to reach up to the tuning pegs and rotate those comes from pretty high up in the neck. And we can do that while also doing the tilt from the hip joints. So we practice this in two different ways, in isolation and together. So we can bend first and then spiral. And we go back and forth from this a bunch of times, bend and then spiral. Breaking those movements down into two separate things can really help to isolate those and kind of figure them out on a body level. So this is the movement equivalent of learning hot cross buns on your instrument. You're slotting everything into place while you're first learning it. And then over time, as you get more fluent with what you're doing, it becomes very fluid, and you can string that together in ways that aren't so stylized and boxy. We don't get mad at beginner instrument players for needing to start with hot cross buns. We also don't get mad at beginner Alexander Technique students for needing to break things apart into multiple movements before putting them together into one more complex movement. Tilt first, then spiral. Or we also practice spiral first and then tilt. What I recommend for my students is, yes, even though realistically with the guitar it's always going to be spiraling to your left, don't neglect the fact that the right side of your body exists. Make sure that when you're taking breaks away from the instrument, you rotate to the right sometimes. It can really help you to not get so stuck into being towards the left all the time. I found that that came up for me as a flute player, where I was always so constantly to the left that actually reoriented my sense of where I was in space. And if I would actually find forward, it would feel like I was rotated to the right because I had reset my sense of what was normal. So same with other instruments that are played to the left. Take breaks by going to the right. That's key. So we're working with the spiral and noticing that you don't have to take the neck forward while you're doing that. So this whole tilt comes from really far down, and it is going to move the instrument as well. The instrument goes with you, and that's fine. It's not a huge tilt. We're not doing this. You will run out of room very quickly. But just this little bend is enough. The thing to really avoid is taking the neck forward. I watched a Baroque ensemble, and there was someone playing a Baroque lute, which is this big like teardrop shape instrument. The body of the instrument was about this high against the player, and there were certain points where this player's cheek was resting on the instrument. I can hold that for about 2 seconds before I start hurting. Highly discourage that. That is not a good plan. Don't recommend. You're gonna get back problems and neck problems from doing that if you're doing it to the frequency and duration that we do with instrument playing. So, with more jazz guitar, that's going to really vary a lot depending on the person. A lot of jazz guitarists and jazz bassists, when they're playing electric bass, will be totally fine with leaning back against the back of the chair, and I've seen several of them, I think, actually do it very effectively. So I'm not about to put any rules on people and say, like, you're not allowed to use the back of the chair if you're playing jazz guitar. You can. I've seen someone do it and it worked really well. This person was rather tall. He was maybe like 6'1", 6'2", and so he could totally still reach the floor with his feet while leaning back in a chair and was just totally comfortable, and I thought it was fine. Didn't have any issues with it. Doing it with lengthening and not taking the neck forward, again, same thing, to be able to look at what you're playing, that's the thing. But if you're not doing that, if you're able to just look over to the neck of the instrument, which is a little bit easier if it's not up at that sharp angle like a classical guitar. If the neck is more horizontal, it's a little bit easier to just like glance over at your hand as you're playing. It's a little bit easier to do that while if you're leaned back against something. So let me show you what that can look like. So again, a tall person, that's a good, 7-8 inches taller than me, is here, not that far, somewhere around there, and he would often cross, I think it was probably this leg, cross ankle onto knee, and was here, and I thought it was fine. He was able to do it in a way that was lengthened, he wasn't pulling his shoulders up. This to me was fine. So I'm not too concerned about the aesthetics of like looking sufficiently proper. I'm much more concerned about the mechanics going on. Last thing I want to mention is standing. Now, classical guitarists are almost never going to stand and play, but jazz and metal guitarists and rock guitarists sure do. And an interesting thing that I see from metal guitarists, and especially metal bassists, for some reason, is they're like here. And so they're playing, and they have a huge wide bass. The bass player for Gender does this. Sometimes the guy from Trivium does this as well, where they just have the feet really wide, far apart. I think that's fine. I don't have a problem with that at all, as long as they're not also taking their necks forward. The issue is headbanging. That I have a problem with. As a metal fan, I had to stop doing that by my mid-20s. So when you see these older rock and metal players who are really doing a lot of head movement, I don't recommend it. I don't think it's a good idea. I think it's a recipe for neck problems. If you are going to do neck movements as part of your stage performance, you need to do some cross training and do neck exercises on purpose to make sure that those muscles are strong enough that you can really keep yourself safe while you're doing that. There's a lot of nerves in your neck. Your spinal cord goes through there. This is a really important part of your body. Please don't hurt it. So if you're going to do, effectively a dance, right? It's a small isolated dance in a particular way. And that can even include side to side. Sure, fine. But these big movements, especially the windmill circle type, it's not going to go well if you do that for a very long time. So that's the one that I don't recommend. I think it's okay to do smaller versions of it, and you can get more involved with torso movement. That's again going to come from more hip joints. If you're going to move while playing, the one I don't recommend is having this huge bend right in the neck, because what you're asking your vertebrae and your spine to do is have a really sharp angle repeatedly for long periods of time. And that's the issue. So, ye guitar players, please take care of yourselves. Please don't hurt yourselves. Take a look at what gear you're using, and if you need to adjust, look at the different options of how to position your instrument. Check in with spiraling. And also check in with, if you're going to look down, it comes from your hip joints. And this is going to keep you a lot less injury prone for a lot longer.